So we talked about how Willy Brandt improved relationships between the East and West. Now let's think about how this extends in a broader sense to the United States with the introduction of a policy called Détente. Now you might be familiar with this from U.S. history as well. So ultimately what détente is a kind of gradual, piece-by-piece improvement and relaxation of Cold War tensions. So this is something that's developed by U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger and U.S. President Richard Nixon. And what they're doing is they're taking Willy Brandt's Eastern initiatives, but they're kind of placing it in a broader American-led framework. And their goal is to reduce East-West tensions in the early 1970s. One of the reasons why they want to take this framework and make it a little bit broader is because they're afraid that Germany might become neutral, and then that would sort of weaken NATO and the US's influence in Europe. So they feel like they need to kind of take this relaxing of tensions by the reins and control it, because they don't feel like it's really going to happen independently just with Germany. Also, Nixon is hoping to, with an improved relationship with the Soviet Union, to kind of get their help with other matters. For example, this is in the middle of the Vietnam War, and Nixon is hoping that if they get along better with the Soviets, that maybe the Soviets can kind of pressure North Vietnam to end the Vietnam War. Now, we know this doesn't actually happen, but still, you see how relaxing relationships with the Soviet Union would actually have beneficial effects in other elements of foreign policy as well. This is actually going back to Otto von Bismarck. This is an example, again, of realpolitik. What Nixon and Kissinger are doing is, they're relaxing the relationship with the Soviet Union to just further their national interest. This doesn't mean that they suddenly accept communism, right? But basically they feel that having a better relationship with the Soviet Union is basically going to help their country, right? It could help them withdraw from Vietnam, which would be very helpful. Also, the thing that they're trying to do is make China and the Soviet Union become sort of distrustful from of one another, and the idea behind that is basically for the Soviet Union and China to be more concerned with one another and pay less attention to the U.S. So actually, Nixon's going to pay 2 visits in 1972, one to China, and we see Nixon meeting with Mao here, and then he's also going to visit Moscow in 1972, so we see Nixon meeting Brezhnev here, and basically the USSR and China now are going to be sort of worried that that the U.S. is going to draw closer to those countries. So in a way, Nixon's visits to both China and Moscow are going to kind of make the rivalry between the U.S. and the USSR and China a little bit stronger, right? So this is a really important strategy, and again, this doesn't mean that the U.S. is going to be more favorable towards communism, but rather they're trying to kind of improve their own national standing. Another positive development, thawing of Cold War tensions, so to speak, is the signing of the SALT Treaty in 1972. SALT stands for Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. So it's signed by Brezhnev and Nixon, and what it does is it agrees to stop making nuclear ballistic missiles and also to reduce the number of anti-ballistic missiles that each power has. So, thinking about the kind of arms race that existed in the 1950s, this is a really significant reduction of nuclear armaments. And again, kind of a signal of the thawing of the Cold War. However, what you're going to see is that shortly afterwards, there's going to be the development of what are called multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles, or MIRVs. And when these are developed, it basically makes the SALT Treaty obsolete. So it's important that they're talking about reducing arms, but ultimately it's not really happening. Another important example of détente is the Helsinki Conference in 1975. So interestingly, despite the fact that World War II has been over now for about 3 decades, Because some of the borders that the Soviet Union dictated after the war was over were never completely legitimized, in a way, the World War II issues were still lingering. So what the Helsinki Conference does is that the powers that meet here, and you see some of them represented down here, Helsinki is in Finland, by the way, all these powers meet and they agree to finally legitimize the borders of Poland and other East European countries that were dictated by the Soviet Union. So this final act is finally going to end World War II by legitimizing these boundaries. There's also an agreement made that these boundaries cannot be changed by force. So again, kind of relaxing tensions between East and West by guaranteeing that there's not going to be sort of a violent conflict challenging these borders, right? And what the USSR gives in exchange for these borders is it agrees to have a little bit more exchanges in a liberal way of people and information between East and West. So basically, the West isn't going to experience so much tight censorship. And also, the Soviets agreed to protect certain human rights within their sphere of influence. Now, the problem with this, though, is that Moscow actually does continue to sort of limit and squelch human rights in Eastern Europe. But still, the Helsinki Conference is an important example of détente because there are some agreements that are made that are favorable between East and West, and it also just shows that the East and West are talking and are very interested in reducing tensions. So détente is a very important but limited period of thawing during the Cold War. Because détente ultimately ends just a few years after Helsinki in 1979 when the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan. After the invasion of Afghanistan, the U.S. refuses to ratify the second SALT treaty, and if that treaty had been ratified, again, it would have reduced nuclear armaments. So it's really important that this treaty is not ratified because it signals the end of détente, essentially. Also, the year after, the Olympics were taking place in Moscow, and President Carter issued a boycott. The U.S. did not participate in the Olympics in Moscow, which was very symbolic, again, of kind of a refreezing of relations between the U.S. and the USSR. And then the Soviets respond by boycotting the subsequent 1984 Olympics in Los Angeles. You're also going to see that the U.S. is going to stop shipping certain materials into the Soviet Union. Prior to that, it was shipping in grain and some advanced technology, but then they close off these exchanges. And these sanctions are important because, again, it shows increased tensions between the East and the West. Now, interestingly, the only country that supports these U.S. sanctions on the Soviet Union is Britain. They have a really special relationship with the U.S. at this point. France, Italy, and West Germany are looking at the U.S. reducing this trade with the Soviet Union, and they're very nervous about it. They feel that the invasion of Afghanistan should be really sort of a regional issue and that the U.S. should not get involved. They feel like even though what the Soviets did was deplorable, they don't want it to turn back into a huge East versus West confrontation. So countries like France, Italy, and West Germany are really feeling like the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan should not be a reason why détente should end and relationships should sour so much. But nonetheless, we know that they do, and we will continue on discussing how Poland ultimately is trying to react against Soviet leadership, and then we'll talk about the eventual dissolution of the USSR in the late 1980s. So that's the Soviet Union under Brezhnev, and we'll continue on with solidarity in Poland for the next video. So just one more little section I want to put under Brezhnev actually is what's going on in Poland, and also how Western countries are kind of reacting to the Soviet Union in the early 1980s. So Poland is actually sort of a unique example within the Eastern Bloc in the sense that The USSR had always struggled to impose communism there. People still continue to own private property there. One of the really, really important things is that the USSR was never able to completely control the influence of the Catholic Church. So that's huge, right? Because we know that under true communism there is no religion, right? And you're also going to see that there's going to be some economic problems in the 1970s, so workers are going to start to protest. But the real important moment that launches some significant movements towards reform in Poland is in 1979. Pope John Paul II was elected Pope, and he was Polish, right? So this is really inspirational to the Polish people. And John Paul II travels through Poland, and he preaches a love of Christ and a love of one's country, and he also preaches the inalienable rights of man. And so listening to this speech, it really sort of inspires the Polish people to organize together and attempt to work towards better treatment in terms of their working conditions, and ultimately the ability to have self-determination within their country and not really be completely dictated by the Soviet Union. So basically it inspires this huge movement of working people, and they organize this big union that's called Solidarity. And Solidarity is led by this man Lech Walesa, who you see here on the Time magazine cover. And Solidarity ends up occupying a industrial plant in Gdansk, which is in the Danzig region, if you remember from the outbreak of World War II. So what are the workers demanding? They ask for the right to form trade unions, they ask for the right to strike, they ask for freedom of speech, they want political prisoners to be released, and they want economic reforms. And at first it's important that the government actually agrees to their demands, and this is called the Gdansk Agreement. But then Solidarity gets really big, and by 1981 you actually have 9.5 million people in the Solidarity movement. And also it's important to realize that the Solidarity movement was not violent, they don't use force, and they also don't take direct control of the government because they fear that there's going to be a Soviet intervention if they do that. So even though they're very large and very organized, at the same time they're not too threatening of the Soviet regime in Poland. But nonetheless, by 1981, the Soviets warn the Polish government. They say, if you guys don't do something to control Solidarity or to stop Solidarity, we will. And, we already know from the Hungarian uprising and the invasion in Czechoslovakia, when the Soviets intervene militarily, it's brutal. They just roll tanks into cities and occupy, right? So basically, because the Soviets warn the Polish government, the Polish Communist Party leader, his name was Jaruzelski, sorry if I pronounced that wrong, he ends up imposing martial law in Poland. And this drives the Solidarity movement underground, and it outlaws it. But at the same time, even though they're driven underground, Solidarity still remains active, and we will see them come back eventually. In the late 1980s, there's going to be some economic deterioration, and this is going to make more and more people support the return of Solidarity, and eventually we will see it come back. Last thing that we need to be familiar with is that, oh, sorry about that, I didn't advance the slide, but there's that stuff about martial law. Last thing that we need to be familiar with is that the Atlantic Alliance, which is a very conservative movement against the Soviet Union, revitalizes in the early 1980s, that is, and it's led by Ronald Reagan, U.S. President, Margaret Thatcher, the U.K. Prime Minister, and then Helmut Kohl of Germany. They basically believe that the USSR continues to be a dangerous threat, and they're really thinking about the invasion of Afghanistan in that sense. And the Atlantic Alliance is going to give indirect support to efforts to liberalize authoritarian governments in Eastern Europe. So they're going against the USSR initiative. And all three of these leaders take a huge hardline approach towards communism. We know Margaret Thatcher was a true conservative. She advocates really hardline military positions. Helmut Kohl was very pro-American, and he was a conservative in Germany. And then Ronald Reagan takes one of the most hardline stances by embarking on massive military buildups, He believed that the U.S. could better bear the financial burden to build up militarily, and the Soviets could not, so he kind of felt like the U.S. had an edge up. And he also initiates a plan called the Strategic Defense Initiative, or Star Wars, and basically he wants to pursue a high-technology missile defense system against the USSR. And he also proclaims the USSR the evil empire after they shoot down a Korean passenger airliner. So you see an increase in